When I came back from the hospital, my house already had a new owner. The street was the same, the trees still cast shadows on the sidewalk, but something was wrong. The curtains, the number on the wall, even the smell of the gate had changed. It was as if I had woken up in a distorted copy of my own life. For months, my body struggled to heal, and I believed my son was taking care of everything. He said he was sorting things out, that I didn't need to worry, that my health was what mattered. I believed him. I always believed him. A mother's love is a house without locks. We open the door even when there's noise on the other side. But the noise grew. First it was his silence. The infrequent visits, the cold messages, the fleeting glances when he came to see me. Then came the small lies, subtle, like invisible cracks in a wall. I sensed the danger, but I denied it. Denial is the instinct of those who love. Until love one day left me without solid ground. Upon leaving the hospital, the taxi driver asked if I was sure of the address. I laughed, not understanding. And when I got out, I realized the gate I had opened for 20 years was now closing on me. The doorbell rang, but a man I had never seen answered. "Ma'am, I think there's been a mistake," he said, and that sentence fell like a stone into a deep well inside my chest. The souvenirs began to parade before my eyes. The first Christmas in that room, the portraits I took on the balcony, the smell of the cornbread that my grandson said was the best in the world. Everything still existed, only without me. I tried to understand. Did my son think I wouldn't come back? That the hospital would be my final resting place? Or did he simply see an opportunity in my silence? There are betrayals that don't stem from anger, but from the calculated coldness of those who confuse love with weakness. They say trust is like porcelain, beautiful, delicate, but once cracked, it's never whole again. And at that moment, in front of my own house, I felt the snap. The dry sound of something breaking forever. But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that there was one detail. A small thread of truth forgotten amidst the lies. Something he overlooked that would end up changing everything. I stood there in front of the gate, my hand trembling on the intercom. And I thought, how does one rebuild a home when the enemy has your blood on it? How does one forgive someone who turns your pain into profit? The afternoon breeze rustled the leaves of the mango tree in the backyard, and each leaf seemed to call me back. My whole life I struggled to build those walls. And now, standing before them, I realized that the loss was greater than bricks and roof. It was the shattering of something sacred. But fate has a quiet sense of humor. Sometimes, it's in times of ruin that it hands over the keys to a turnaround. And unknowingly, my son had left a door open, one that even he wouldn't be able to close. The man at the door looked at me with a mixture of pity and embarrassment. "That house was sold 2 months ago," he said, as if apologizing for a tragedy he didn't cause. I felt the ground give way beneath my feet. 2 months. Exactly the time I spent hospitalized, lying among machines, believing that my life awaited me outside. 2 words echoed in my head. He sold it. My son, the same one I held in my arms, the same one I cried when he got married, the same one I swore to love even in his mistakes, had sold my house. My only security. And what hurt most wasn't the loss of the walls, but the loss of trust. Because when betrayal comes from someone who owes you loyalty, the blow pierces the soul like glass. I remember the wind rustling the hospital curtains, the promises he made to me on the phone. "Everything will be all right, Mom." His voice sounded sweet, rehearsed. And I, foolishly, believed him. I saw the future through his words, like someone looking at an old photograph and wanting to relive what has already passed. Now, looking at that house, I realized that each of those promises was just the sound of a door closing. I stood on the sidewalk, observing the facade that I had once painted with my own hands. The same beige color, the same iron gate, the same garden. But everything seemed dead, like an embalmed memory. The new resident tried to be kind, offering me a glass of water, but the taste of the iron gate still lingered in my mouth. I thanked him and refused. There was no thirst that water could quench. I wandered aimlessly down the street, and every neighbor who saw me looked away. Some pretended not to know. Others cringed with second-hand embarrassment. I knew what they were thinking. Poor thing. That word weighs more than any stone. But behind the whispers was something no one saw, a spark of fire igniting inside me. A silent, slow, but relentless fire. That night, I slept at a childhood friend's house. The mattress was thin, the room small, but the silence lulled me to sleep. Between thoughts, I began to remember everything that was mine. Documents, photos, receipts, the old house keys I still kept in my bag. Every detail seemed to call me back, as if something inside still belonged to me. The next day, I went to the registry office. The white walls and the smell of old paper reminded me of the days when I signed the original deed. I could still see my husband's face beside me, proud, saying, "This house is our legacy." And it was there, in front of a tired clerk and an old computer, that I asked for a copy of the records. I just wanted to understand, to know what was left of what I had built. The time I waited for the answer seemed like an eternity. Meanwhile, I watched the sun streaming through the windows of the registry office, drawing lines of light on the floor. I thought about how many times I had dimmed my own light so that my son could shine. How many dreams I had given up so that he could have his. And now he was leaving me in the dark. The employee called me over, and when I looked at the paper, I noticed something. A small detail, almost insignificant, but one that no one had noticed before. I didn't yet know what it meant, but I felt a chill. Premonition. That's why so many people choose to stay here, following each revelation. Because sometimes, what seems like the end is just the beginning of a reckoning that destiny has been silently planning. I left there with the document in my hands. The wind from the street stirred up dust, but I could feel the clean air entering my lungs. With each step, the pain began to give way to clarity. And even without understanding everything, I knew what my son had forgotten would be his ruin, and my liberation. The paper trembled in my hands. The letters seemed to dance under the yellowish light of the notary's office. And for a moment I thought it was fear playing tricks on me. But it wasn't. It was all there, clear, cold, and printed. The deed was still in my name. The sale had been made with a forged signature, mine. A crooked, trembling, poorly done stroke. He hadn't even bothered to imitate it properly. Pierced me like a blade. I felt the cold floor beneath my feet and the noise of the ceiling fans spinning. It was as if the whole world had stopped, except for the sound of my heart, beating too loudly inside my chest. And in the midst of the shock, came the most terrible of feelings. Calm disappointment. The kind that doesn't scream, doesn't break anything, but settles in silently and permanently. I didn't cry. Couldn't. The tears no longer fit on my face. They were trapped somewhere deeper. I left the registry office not knowing where to go. The wind outside was hot and dry, making the pages of a newspaper swirl on the ground. The headlines spoke of crimes, betrayals, disasters, and I realized that I was now part of that same category. A family tragedy without an audience, but with all the ingredients of ruin. I walked to the square where I used to take my son when he was little. I sat on the same bench, under the same tree. The sound of children playing in the distance tore at my heart. I remembered him, still a boy with scraped knees and a wide smile, running towards me. "Did you see me, Mom? I did it," he shouted proudly, for having climbed the highest playground equipment. And now, years later, that same son had pushed me off the top without looking back. As the sun set, the orange light painted everything in a deceptive gold, too beautiful for such a bitter day. I picked up the document again and observed it in the twilight. It was as if each line told a story of carelessness and disrespect. The forged signature was a symbol of what he had become. A rootless man, willing to sever his own origins in exchange for some easy money. But amidst the pain, something changed inside me. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but real. Like an ember hidden beneath the ashes. I began to think differently. To see that that betrayal could be the beginning of something. Not for him, but for me. I spent my life believing that protecting was loving, that yielding was proof of kindness. But on that day, I realized that perhaps loving also meant defending oneself. I went to the bus terminal and bought a one-way ticket to the neighboring city. I only took my purse and ID. The driver looked at me in the rearview mirror and asked if I was okay. "Not yet," I replied. And he just nodded, as if understanding that certain answers need time. During the journey, night fell and the road lights flickered like ghosts. Inside the bus, the sound of the engine was constant, almost hypnotic. I closed my eyes and imagined my son's face when he discovered what I had done. He believed that all was lost for me, but the detail he forgot, that piece of paper, was now my shield. And more than that, it was the map to my silent revenge. As the bus moved forward, I felt the first breath of freedom in years. And, for the first time since the hospital, I fell asleep peacefully. Because now I knew that fate had given me back something more valuable than home, the chance to choose the ending of my own story. What I would do with it was still open. But one thing was certain: the woman who got off at that stop was no longer the same one who had been hospitalized. The city where I got off seemed smaller than I remembered. The streets were narrow. The air smelled of warm bread and wood smoke. There was something welcoming about that calm chaos, as if each corner invited me to start again, even though I still carried the wreckage of what was left behind. I walked slowly, feeling the weight of the paper inside my bag. The same paper that now seemed to pulsate, as if it had a life of its own. The deed in my name wasn't just a document. It was the invisible thread that connected everything I had been, everything I had lost, and everything I was yet to become. I found a small room for rent in the back of an old boarding house. The owner was a woman with kind eyes, used to hearing stories from those who arrived wounded and wanted to rebuild their lives. She didn't ask much, just offered me a clean bed, a bowl of soup, and silence. And it was there, in that silence, that I realized how long it had been since I had listened to myself. That night, the rain began to fall slowly. The drops hit the tin roof, creating an almost hypnotic rhythm. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching the reflection of the streetlights dancing on the wall. I remembered every detail of the house my son sold. The wooden windows, the creaking floorboards near the kitchen, the smell of soap and fresh coffee. That memory both pained and warmed me. It was pain and home, loss and memory. For days, I was torn between the urge to act and the desire to simply forget. But forgetting isn't freedom, it's anesthesia. And I didn't want to numb myself. I wanted to understand. I wanted to know what made my son go so far, what broke within him that caused him to break me. When love rots, the smell lingers. And mine, even wounded, still breathed. That's when I started visiting the registry office in the neighboring city, looking for more details about the sale. Every record, every signature, every document confirmed the same thing. He had forged everything. But what caught my attention was a clause that had gone unnoticed even by his lawyers. Something about automatic annulment in case of proven fraud. My heart raced. Legally, the house was still mine. And if I wanted, I could reclaim not only the keys but the truth. At that moment, I realized that destiny wasn't taking anything away from me. It was testing me. And it's at this point that many feel the urge to support this journey, leaving a silent sign that the message touched them. Because there's something profoundly human in seeing someone rise from the ashes calmly, without shouting, only with the firmness of someone who has already cried enough. I could have sought immediate revenge. I could have exposed my son to everyone, made him a public example of ingratitude. But anger, when misused, only binds us to what hurt us. I needed something greater, an end that wasn't destruction but justice. I began to observe from afar. I discovered that he was living in debt, that he had spent the money on gambling, trying to multiply what he had stolen. It was strange. Part of me still wanted to save him, as if motherhood didn't know how to give up. But another part, the one that had finally learned to protect itself, knew it was time to let him deal with his own ruins. The rain stopped. The sound of the raindrops was replaced by the chirping of crickets, and the dawn smelled of wet earth. I closed my eyes and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. A silent, mature, almost serene hope. As if the universe were whispering that justice would come, and that, when it did, it would be irrefutable. I didn't know when or how, but I was ready to wait. Because time, unlike people, never forgets what is right. In the days that followed, I began to feel time working in my favor. It was as if each sunrise brought a new piece of the puzzle, and I just needed patience for everything to fall into place. The silence of the boarding house, once heavy, now seemed like a refuge. The sound of footsteps in the hallway, the creaking of the old doors, the smell of the black coffee made by the landlady before sunrise. Everything gained meaning. There was a strange peace in being alone, a calm I had never known when I lived surrounded by people who only knew how to demand. One morning, I decided to visit the old neighborhood where my house used to be. I needed to see with my own eyes what was still left of me there. The path was the same, but everything seemed smaller. The trees that once covered the sidewalk were now pruned, the facades of the houses painted in different shades, and the voices of the neighbors sounded distant, like echoes of a life that no longer belonged to me. When I stopped in front of the gate, the same chill ran down my spine. But this time there was no sadness. There was observation. I looked at that place as one reads an old book, with respect, but without attachment. The new owner appeared on the porch. He recognized me. He said he had heard about the confusion with the sale and that he was very sorry for everything. His tone was sincere. He explained that he was having problems with the paperwork, that the bank had blocked part of the purchase due to suspected fraud. That clause I had discovered at the notary's office was now showing its effects. Destiny, silently, was beginning to act. And for the first time I perceived the power of time. It doesn't hurry, but it is relentless. The conversation with that man brought me something I didn't expect: compassion. He too was a victim of the same deception. It wasn't against him that I was fighting, but against what my son had become. As I listened to him talk about the lost money, the lawyers, and the back-and-forth trips to the courthouse, I realized that everyone paid a price for a lie. Some with their wallets, others with their consciences, and my son with his very soul. I returned to the guest house at dusk. The sky was orange, and the light streamed through the cracks in the window like molten gold. I sat at the table and picked up the document again. The letters were already worn at the edges from so much handling. It was strange to think that a simple piece of paper could contain so much history. I looked at it for minutes in silence until something caught my attention. A pen note, almost erased, made by my husband. A date, a number, and a name, his lawyer. My heart skipped a beat. The same man who had handled the purchase of the house decades ago still lived in the city. It was as if the past was extending its hand to me again, inviting me to yet another truth. I put the paper in my bag and decided to look for him the next day. The night arrived cold. The sound of the rain returned, rhythmic, as on the first nights I took refuge there. But now the sound was different. It no longer brought memories of loss, but of preparation. It was the sound of something being purified, of a story being washed away before beginning again. As I watched the raindrops trickling down the window, I felt a mixture of fear and hope. Fear of what I might still discover. Hope of finally closing a cycle that had robbed me of so much. With each distant thunderclap, it seemed the universe whispered what I already knew. Justice doesn't announce itself with noise, it approaches in silence. And when it arrives, it comes with the exact weight of what was taken. I fell asleep with that certainty, clutching the document like someone holding an old promise. And even though I didn't know what the next day would bring, something inside me was growing. A serene, almost invisible but real courage. The feeling that what was about to happen would change everything, in a way I couldn't even imagine. Dawn brought a gentle chill, the kind that awakens the skin and leaves the soul clearer. I got up before the noise in the boarding house kitchen, sat on the edge of the bed and stayed for a while with my feet on the cold floor, breathing slowly. The faded pen in the corner of the document looked like an old lighthouse, and I followed that light. I drank a bitter coffee, put on the coat I inherited from my mother, and went out to meet the lawyer from the past, with a feeling of walking inside a photograph that had decided to move again. The office was in a single-story house, with cream-colored walls, tall windows, and the smell of stored paper and waxed wood. The pendulum clock ticked the hours as if it were both hurried and calm at the same time. He recognized me by my husband's last name, adjusted his glasses, and asked me to sit down. His hands were firm, the hands of someone who had seen many falls and a few new beginnings. I told the story in a few words. He listened to everything without interrupting, like someone picking up shards with thick cloths to avoid cutting themselves. Then he pulled out an old folder, yellowed at the corners, and took out more than just papers. He pulled out an entire life organized in stamps, notarized signatures, receipts, and handwritten notes. There was not only the deed there, but proof of something I didn't know. My husband, many years before, had registered an addendum. It wasn't about money. It was about protection. A clause that shielded the house from any sale without my physical presence, and a password of ours. A simple word, noted in a notary's office as a verification seal. Nobody knew it, except the two of us and the lawyer himself. I read it and felt my heart beat in the old way, when hope still fit entirely within my chest. My son had forgotten the most human detail of all. Parents who love each other usually protect each other from the future. I left the office with the folded paper in my bag, like someone carrying a talisman. The street seemed different. The sun peeked through the leaves of the trees, and the warm wind carried the smell of bread and gasoline. I crossed the square slowly, watching the boys on the swing, a woman watering plants in a cracked pot, a man pushing a wheelbarrow full of fresh fruit. Life went on, and this going on hurt and healed in equal measure. Gain and loss side by side, walking with me. On the way back I bought a new notebook. I decided to write down names, dates, gestures. Not out of petty revenge, but so as not to lose the memory of what brought me here. At home, I spent the afternoon copying the information from the process, the registration numbers, the new buyer's contact information, the trips to the bank. I also noted what didn't fit into a protocol. The smell of the boarding house room after the rain, the texture of the dish towel I used to dry the cup, the sound of the neighbor's gate at 6 in the afternoon. All of this was my invisible fortress, an emotional map that reminded me that, even in ruins, there was still ground to stand on. Night fell heavy and blue. I turned on the bedside lamp, and the yellow light cast calm shadows on the wall. I thought of my son as two distinct people. The boy with scraped knees who called me in the playground, and the man with hard eyes who forged my name. Part of me was still searching for the first within the second, like someone searching for fire under cold ashes. Another part already knew that it's necessary to accept the absence to begin breathing again. Motherhood is a realm with shifting borders. Sometimes love shouts and embraces. Sometimes love closes the gate to protect the house within. I lay there sleepless. I listened to the noises of the boarding house. A radio playing softly, footsteps in the hallway, the creaking of the cooling roof. And I thought about the secret layers of the word justice. There is a justice that arrives in robes, with stamps, published in the official gazette. And there is another that arrives silently, when we begin to treat each other with the respect that was denied us. One does not replace the other. They walk together. Light and shadow once more, sharing the same face. In the early morning the phone vibrated. It was a message from the buyer's unknown number. "We need to talk. I found something in the contract that you might want to see." I felt a thin, precise draft of air sweep through the room. I replied yes with a few words and turned off the screen. I stared into the darkness for a while, noticing how the body learns to wait. The fear hadn't disappeared. It walked alongside hope, testing my steps. And, curiously, I no longer felt like I was on the edge of the abyss. I was on a bridge. Dark, long, firm enough to support my weight. I thought about the next day, and in it lay all the possibilities. The bank, the courthouse, the buyer's desk with open contracts, the lawyer's office, the gate of my old house creaking again, perhaps under my hands. In each image, there was a suspended breath, the promise of a key turning that hasn't yet happened. It's strange how life concentrates entirely on an instant that never arrives, and yet shapes us before we even exist. Closed my eyes. I felt my heart beat less erratically, and silently thanked the woman who had crossed the hospital, the closed gate, the registry office, the square, and the rain. She was still me, only deeper. I fell asleep with my bag resting on the chair, the document folded like a sleeping bird. And in the midst of sleep, I heard the pendulum of the lawyer's clock again, marking the time as if warning. It won't be long now. I will wake up when necessary. And when I wake up, the house they tore from me will have another door. Perhaps the same one as always, perhaps one I don't yet know. But in any case, there will be an entrance. And the rest, however much it hurts, awaits a name. The following morning dawned brighter than I had expected, but the brightness carried a weight. I woke with my heart beating slowly, as if my body knew before I did that this day would bring something. The buyer was waiting for me at the same cafe on the corner by the courthouse. When I arrived, he was already there, with the papers on the table and the tense look of someone carrying a secret they don't know how to tell. I ordered a black coffee and waited in silence. He took a deep breath before beginning to speak. He said that, upon reviewing the contract with the bank, he found an inconsistency. My son's lawyer had used an old document, an invalid template, which included a line of joint liability. In other words, all debt generated by the sale, interest, taxes, fees, now also fell on whoever signed as the legal representative of the owner. And that name, of course, was my son's. His face plastered there, trapped by his own mistake. I felt my whole body tremble. It wasn't revenge, it was justice unfolding patiently. Destiny has a curious way of settling accounts. It doesn't need haste, only precision. While he explained the details to me, I watched people walking outside, cars passing by, the sun reflecting off the shop windows. The world moved on, and there, between a sip of coffee and a signature lost in time, the plot of my life began to change its tone. The buyer wanted to propose a settlement, a way to resolve everything without fighting. He said he no longer trusted my son's lawyers and that he was willing to help me recover what was mine. I listened calmly. There was no rush. I've learned that haste is the younger sister of loss. He handed me a brown envelope and asked me to read it at home. Inside were copies of emails, receipts, and a recording. Evidence. The missing thread to stitch together our destiny. I walked back to the boarding house, the envelope pressed against my chest. Each step felt like a rehearsal for something bigger. People hurried past, but I was on a different wavelength. The wind carried the smell of warm bread, of gasoline, of normal life. And it was precisely this normality that hurt. How can the world keep turning while we try to piece together what's left? At home, I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the envelope. The recording was of a meeting between my son and the lawyer. I heard the low voices, almost whispered, talking about resolving this quickly before she comes back, about no one will notice, about it's just paperwork. Each phrase was a blow, but it didn't hurt as much anymore. Now it was just confirmation. The truth has that power. When it arrives, it doesn't hurt, it sets you free. I stopped the recording before it ended. I didn't need to listen to everything. There was a point where the heart understands more than the ears. I closed my eyes and imagined my son there, talking about me as if I were an obstacle and not the woman who brought him into the world. For a moment I felt pity, then only distance. It's strange to realize that love also knows how to withdraw when it's no longer recognized. That night I couldn't sleep. The sounds of the city outside reminded me that time doesn't stop for anyone, and maybe that was a good thing. I wrote down everything I remembered in my new notebook. Dates, names, emotions, even the smell of coffee during our conversation. I wanted nothing to be lost, because every forgotten pain returns disguised. I looked at the ceiling and thought about how many women have already experienced the same thing, trusting, being betrayed, rebuilding. And I wondered how many of them had the chance to see fate work in their favor. Maybe few, maybe none. So, if this story reminds you of something the world tried to take from you, say it. Leave a mark. Sometimes sharing is the quietest way to break free. When the clock struck midnight, I closed my notebook and turned off the light. I was left only with the memory of the recording sound still echoing. There was no anger, no hurry, just a serene tension in the air. The certainty that life still had something to give back to me, and that this return was closer than I had ever been to understanding. The next morning, the world seemed the same, but I was no longer the same woman. There was something different in the air. A slight, almost imperceptible tension, like when the wind announces a storm that hasn't yet arrived. I knew what I had in my hands. The evidence, the documents, the recording, everything. But along with it came the weight of what I would have to do with it. The truth is a double-edged sword. It liberates, but it cuts. And I needed to decide how much I was willing to bleed. The envelope lay on the table, still open. The sun streamed through the window, illuminating the paper with an almost cruel brightness. I read and reread the same words until they began to lose their meaning. My son had lied. And not just lied, he had planned it. It hadn't been an impulsive mistake, but a cold, calculated choice. And that hurt more than any material loss. Because betrayal, when premeditated, transforms love into ruin. I went out for a walk. The street was alive, full of familiar sounds and smells. The distant noise of cars, the cries of market vendors, the laughter of a child escaping between the stalls. I walked slowly, trying to fit life back into myself. Each step was an attempt to breathe again, to understand how you go on after discovering that the worst wound came from within your own home. In the middle of the square, I sat on the same bench where I used to wait for my husband many years ago. The same wooden bench, now worn by time. The memory of him came to me like a whisper. His calm voice, the way he would place his hands on mine and say that everything has its right time to reveal itself. He believed in the justice of simple things. The rain that always returns, the flower that blooms again, the sun that insists on rising even after the darkest night. And I, at that moment, clung to that. I picked up the phone and called the lawyer who had helped me in the past. His voice, hoarse and patient, brought me back to reality. I told him everything. He listened in silence, asking short, direct questions. When I finished, he simply said, "The truth is on your side. But you need to decide if you want to win or if you want to heal." I was speechless. 'Cause he was right. Sometimes, victory comes with the bitter taste of what cannot be recovered. I returned home with my head full of voices. The voice of justice, the voice of love, the voice of resentment. All mingling. In the room, the ticking of the clock marked the time, and the smell of rain began to seep in through the window. I sat before the mirror and stared at my own reflection. The wrinkles around my eyes, the gray hair, the tired skin. Everything told me a story the world pretended not to see. And I thought about how many times I'd been told to be understanding, to be good, to forgive. But no one asked me what happens when kindness becomes a prison. I ran my fingers over the mirror frame and realized they no longer trembled. There was strength in the silence. A strength I had never known how to name before. I began to write a letter, not to the judge, nor to the lawyers, but to my son. Line after line, I recounted what he had done, what it had destroyed, and what was left of me. The words came out slowly, firmly, laden with everything that had never been said. When I finished, I folded the paper and put it in the envelope. I didn't know if I would deliver it. Maybe it wasn't for him. Maybe it was just for me. The sky darkened suddenly. The first drops fell on the balcony, and the sound of the rain seemed to whisper my name. I closed the curtains, sat in the armchair, and stayed there, listening to the rhythm of the water hitting the roof. There was something purifying in that sound, as if the world were washing away my pain. I thought about everything that was to come. The courtroom, the stairs, the exposed truths, the silences that would scream louder than any words. Night fell slowly, without haste, as if it knew I still needed time. And I understood that destiny was preparing me, not to destroy what remained, but to rebuild who I was. It wasn't yet time to act. It was time to observe, to let time fulfill the role it has always fulfilled, to reveal, calmly and precisely, what each one truly deserves. The rain continued, steady and constant, and within its rhythm, there was a silent promise. Something told me that the next morning would bring not only answers, but also their price. And for the first time I did not fear the cost. Dawn had barely broken when the sound of rain was replaced by a thick silence, the kind of silence that precedes something inevitable. I got up before the sun even touched the curtains, put on the same worn coat, and put the envelope back in my bag. I didn't know if the day would bring solace or more pain, but I knew I needed to look into the eyes of what remained of the truth. The air was cold, and the wet ground reflected the first golden hues of the morning. Each step was a precise cut, as if time were testing me to see if I still had the courage to go on. When I arrived at the courthouse, the walls seemed higher than ever. The corridors smelled of old paper and disinfectant, and the voices echoed like prayers without faith. The lawyer was waiting for me at the entrance, with the look of someone who already knows that fate is about to turn the page. We walked together to the courtroom. Inside, the air was thick, and the clock ticked away the hours with the slowness of a weary heart. My son arrived a few minutes later. He was dejected, but still tried to maintain the haughty air of someone who believes they control the narrative. Our eyes met for a moment, and for the first time I didn't see the boy I raised. I saw only a man lost in his own reflection, trying to hide his fear behind his arrogance. It was then that I understood. His punishment had already begun, and I didn't need to say a word for him to know. As the judge spoke, I watched my son's hands trembling on the table. The papers before him were the same ones that condemned him, and the lawyer's voice sounded distant, like a tide receding weakly. The buyer confirmed everything. He showed the recording, the messages, the receipts. Each sentence was a blade cutting through the thin fabric of lies. And with each word, his mask slipped a little further. There was a moment of silence. The kind of silence that doesn't need sound to be heard. The judge looked at me, then at himself, and announced the sentence. The sale was null and void, and the property would be returned to its original name, mine. The echo of the words reverberated within me like a contained thunderclap. It wasn't victory, it was balance. The scales slowly returning to the center. I left the courthouse with the document in my hands, the same one that had once been used to take everything from me. Outside, the sun was already breaking through the clouds, and the city seemed to breathe with me. I walked slowly. The wind brushed against my face, and for a second I thought about crying. But the tears didn't come. There was a new serenity, as if something inside me had finally returned to its rightful place. I passed by the house that was once mine. The gate was ajar. I entered slowly. The garden was different, but the rose bushes still stood firm in the corner of the wall, stubborn, blooming among the cracks. I touched the damp petals and felt the scent of the past mingling with the present. The pain hadn't disappeared. It had only transformed into a memory. It was then that I realized my revenge was never about the house, the money, or the justice of men. It was about reclaiming something much deeper. The right to exist without asking permission. The right to look back without bowing my head. I started walking again, and with each step the ground seemed firmer. The world at last was balanced once more, between light and shadow, gain and loss, love and absence. There was no happy ending, but there was something better, the truth, and that alone was enough. Perhaps that's why so many people, upon hearing stories like mine, feel the urge to leave their mark. A word, a comment, a fragment of empathy. Because deep down we all carry with us some sold home, some piece of life taken without warning, and the hope that one day fate will remember us. Justice isn't noisy. It arrives like this, silently, firmly, at the right time. And when it comes, it doesn't just return what was stolen. It returns who you were before you were hurt. And it's in that moment that life, for the first time in a long time, breathes in peace. Night fell slowly, as if time had finally learned to respect my silence. The house was empty, but for the first time in a long time, that emptiness didn't frighten me. I walked through the rooms with slow steps, listening to the sound of my own feet touching the floor that once seemed lost. I touched the walls, still cold from the renovation, and felt the rough texture under my palm. Each crack told a piece of the story they tried to erase, but which was now mine again. I opened the windows. The wind came in, bringing the smell of wet earth and memories. The world outside remained the same. The neighbors chatting on the sidewalk, the dog barking in the distance, the chirping of crickets. But inside me everything had changed. I was no longer the woman who left here crying. I was the woman who returned. And returning didn't just mean recovering what had been taken, but understanding that sometimes life needs to break us completely so that we can put ourselves back together with our own hands. I went to the bedroom and found, at the bottom of the drawer, an old photograph. Me, my husband, and my son, still a child, with his hand stained with birthday cake. The image trembled between my fingers. It hurt to look at it, but not with the same pain as before. Now it was a clean, mature pain, the pain of someone who accepts what was and what will no longer be. I placed the photo on the table and lit a candle beside it. The flame flickered slowly, and the light danced on the smiling face of the boy who once called me mother. I felt the urge to forgive, but not for him, for myself. Because carrying hatred is like drinking poison hoping the other person will die. I learned that forgiveness doesn't erase. It only returns power to the one who survived. And I survived. Outside, the sky began to lighten. The first sign of dawn mingled with the distant sound of a rooster. I opened the gate and stood on the sidewalk, watching the horizon change color. The light rose slowly, tinging the rooftops, the tree branches, the power lines. It was as if the whole world breathed along with me. With each breath, I felt lighter. With each exhale, I left behind the weight that held me down. I thought about everything I'd been through. In the hospital, at the store, with the betrayal in court. I thought about the women who came before me, who were also silenced, deceived, discarded. And I realized that, in some way, they were all there with me, pushing me forward. Revenge, after all, wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of liberation. Back in the room, I sat in the armchair, closed my eyes, and listened to the sound of the house breathing again. Felt pride. Not the pride of having defeated someone, but the pride of having defeated myself. The fragile, insecure, submissive version of myself that believed love and dependence were the same thing. Life has taught me that strength lies not in shouting, but in calmness. That justice doesn't need to be loud to be just. And that dignity, when recovered, shines brighter than any victory. So, if you're listening to me now, perhaps you can understand what I mean. There are times when the world tries to tear you down, but it's in that instant that you discover that the roots were within you all along. Perhaps that's why so many people choose to stay here, witnessing each revelation, because they know that all pain can be transformed into a seed. Today I am that seed. And my house, rebuilt, is no longer just a dwelling. It's a symbol. A silent reminder that those who try to extinguish us, unknowingly, ignite something greater. And if this story touched you, if it reminded you of something that time tried to erase, leave your mark too. Sometimes, a simple gesture is the echo that keeps alive the courage of those who have almost given up. Because in the end, that's what truly matters. Starting over without fear, forgiving without giving in, and moving forward knowing that true home was never a house. It was always the heart of someone who learned to stand tall, even after everything.